Her name was Henrietta Lacks. She was 31 years old, a mother of 5. She was a tobacco farmer from Clover, Virginia, who had moved to Baltimore with her husband, David, during the war years, chasing work at the steel mills. She liked to dance. She painted her toenails red. She was, by every account of everyone who knew her, a woman who filled a room with warmth. On January 29, 1951, she walked into Johns Hopkins Hospital complaining of vaginal bleeding. Doctors found a large malignant tumor on her cervix. While she was on the table, without asking her, without telling her, without her knowledge or consent, a surgeon shaved a dime-sized piece of tissue from her tumor. Those cells would go on to become one of the most important tools in the history of medicine. They contributed to the polio vaccine, they went to space, they helped develop the COVID-19 vaccine. They have been bought and sold and replicated in laboratories on every continent for over 70 years. Henrietta Lacks died 8 months after walking into that hospital. She was only 31 years old, and her family didn't find out about HeLa for more than 2 decades. History has an official version, sanitized, approved, filed away. And then there's everything that didn't make it into that version. The programs that were classified before anyone could ask questions, the groups that gathered power in the shadows of ordinary life, the experiments into human consciousness that serious institutions funded, studied, and then buried. My name is Mila. This is The Periphery, dark history, hidden cults, and the edges of the human mind. Welcome to the part of the record they did not want you to find. They classified it, and we're declassifying it, one episode at a time. A note before we begin. This is the second episode in a 3-part series on what happens when science operates without ethical accountability. Episode 5 covered Project Sunshine, the covert government program that harvested infant bones without consent to study nuclear fallout. Episode 6 is the story of Henrietta Lacks. Episode 7 will take us somewhere darker still. You can listen to each episode independently, but if you want the full picture of what institutions are capable of when nobody's watching, I recommend you start at the beginning. I want to spend time here that most tellings of this story don't, because the way the story of Henrietta Lacks usually gets told, even in sympathetic accounts, tends to center the cells, the science, the discovery, the extraordinary biological quirk that made HeLa possible. And Henrietta Lacks, the actual woman, the person who was in that hospital bed, becomes a footnote in her own story. So before we talk about what her cells did for the world, I want to talk about her. Henrietta Pleasant was born on August 1st in 1920 in Roanoke, Virginia. Her mother died when she was only 4 years old, and her father, unable to care for all his children alone, divided them among relatives. Henrietta went to Clover, Virginia, to live with her grandfather, Tommy Lacks, in a log cabin that had once been the slave quarters of a plantation. She grew up in that cabin. She went to school as far as the 6th grade, the furthest Black children could go in Clover at the time, and she worked in the tobacco fields. She was, by every account, beloved by her community around her. She married her cousin David Lacks, called Day, when she was 14 years old. They had their first child at 14 and their second at 17. When the United States entered World War II, Day moved to Baltimore to work at the Bethlehem steel plant at Sparrows Point, and Henrietta followed with their children. Baltimore in the 1950s was a deeply segregated city. Johns Hopkins, situated in Maryland, was a segregated hospital, and it remained so until 1957. But unlike other medical institutions, it would treat African Americans, even if the treatment offered differed from that given to white patients. This distinction matters. Johns Hopkins was not a place of equality. It was a place of access, which, for Black patients in 1950s Baltimore, was not nothing. But access and equality are different things, and the difference between them is part of what made what happened to Henrietta Lacks possible. A common belief by scientists who worked in public wards at this time was that it was fair to use African Americans as research subjects as a form of payment. I want to sit with that sentence for a moment. Not as an artifact of a more ignorant time, but as a window into the specific logic that made Project Sunshine possible, that made Tuskegee possible, that made what happened to Henrietta Lacks possible. The logic that says, your body, your tissue, your biological material is payment for the privilege of receiving care. That says, You are a research subject first and a patient second. That says your consent is not required because your presence here is already a gift we are giving you. This logic did not disappear in 1951. It evolved. It became more sophisticated. It hid itself inside legal frameworks and standard consent forms and the fine print of agreements that most people sign without reading because they are sick and frightened and they trust the institution in front of them. On January 29, 1951, Henrietta Lacks felt something wrong. Vaginal bleeding that hadn't stopped, pain that wouldn't resolve. She went to Johns Hopkins alone without telling her husband or her family, because that was the kind of woman that she was. She handled things. Gynecologist Howard Jones diagnosed a malignant cervical tumor, later confirmed as epidermoid carcinoma with adenocarcinoma features, likely HPV-related. She began treatment with radium brachytherapy, the best available treatment at that time. She came back and forth to the hospital for months, continuing to care for her 5 children, continuing to run her household, continuing, as far as her family knew, to manage. On February 5th, 1951, during radium brachytherapy at the segregated Johns Hopkins Hospital, Surgeon Lawrence Wharton Jr. biopsied Lacks' tumor without consent. The sample went to a researcher named George Gay, and George Gay's assistant put Henrietta's cells in a culture medium. And unlike every other human cell anyone had ever tried to culture, which died within days, Henrietta's cells kept dividing every 20 to 24 hours, indefinitely. They were, in the language of biology, immortal. Here is what HeLa cells made possible. Jonas Salk used them to develop and test the polio vaccine in 1952, a vaccine that has effectively eradicated a disease that paralyzed hundreds of thousands of children every year. They were used in the development of chemotherapy treatments. They contributed to gene mapping and the understanding of how cancer cells behave. They were sent on early space missions to study the effects of zero gravity on human cells. They contributed to in vitro fertilization research. They are among the most important tools in medicine. And in 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic began and the world needed a vaccine faster than any vaccine had ever been developed before, HeLa cells were part of that research too. Henrietta Lacks had been dead for over 70 years. Her cells have never stopped working. Cells were harvested without informed consent, a 1950s norm amid Jim Crow segregation, leading to the commercialization and profits without family benefits. By 1955, HeLa cells were being sold commercially. While Johns Hopkins leaders deny the institution profited from the distribution of HeLa cells, the cells have led to new drugs and procedures that have generated billions of dollars, while many Lacks family members couldn't afford health insurance. Billions of dollars generated from her cells, and her family couldn't afford health insurance. Henrietta Lacks died on October 4th, 1951, 8 months after walking into Johns Hopkins. The cancer had spread throughout her body and she was in extraordinary pain at the end. She asked the nurses to make sure Day took care of the children. She was only 31 years old. Her family buried her in an unmarked grave in Clover, Virginia, the same land where she had grown up, in the shadow of the old plantation slave quarters. And then the world moved on. Science moved forward. HeLa cells multiplied in laboratories across the globe, and nobody told her family anything. For more than 20 years, the Lacks family had no idea. While transformative research was being conducted using the HeLa cell line, her family had no idea that their mother's cells had been kept, nor did they have the scientific knowledge to understand the prospect of cell culture and how cells could be used for medical advancements. It wasn't until the early 1970s when a researcher contacted the family looking for blood samples to help differentiate HeLa cells from other cell lines that had become contaminated that the Lacks family even began to understand that something had been taken from Henrietta. The experience of learning was, for the family, deeply traumatic. They didn't have the scientific literacy to understand what a cell line was. They were told their mother was alive, in a sense, in laboratories around the world, and they didn't know whether to feel proud or violated or both. Henrietta's daughter, Deborah, spent much of her adult life trying to understand what had happened to her mother. trying to find out who Henrietta had been before she became HeLa, trying to grieve a woman she barely remembered, and reclaim a story that had been told without her family's participation. Now, I want to do something in this episode that we haven't done before in the Periphery. I want to imagine a different version of this story, not as a fantasy, but as a serious exercise in understanding what ethical medicine could have looked like and what it cost everyone that it didn't. It's 1951. George Gay's laboratory at Johns Hopkins has been trying for years to culture human cells outside the body, and nothing has worked. Every cell line dies within days. Henrietta Lacks is a patient with an unusually aggressive cancer whose cells, preliminary observation suggests, may behave differently from anything they've seen before. What if someone walked into her room and said, "Henrietta, we'd like to ask your permission to use a sample of your cells for research. If they contribute to something significant, we want you to know that, and we want your family to benefit." What would she have said? Everyone who knew Henrietta Lacks described a woman of extraordinary generosity, a woman who fed people, who took in family members, who gave without being asked. The people who loved her believe, almost universally, that she would have said yes. If they had asked, if informed consent had been obtained and a formal agreement reached, the history of HeLa cells does not change. The polio vaccine still gets developed, the cancer research still happens, the scientific breakthroughs are the same. What changes is everything around them. Henrietta Lacks' name is attached to her cells from the very beginning. Her family is notified when the cells prove extraordinary. A royalty structure or benefit agreement means that as HeLa cells are commercialized, the Lacks family participates in their value. Deborah Lacks grows up knowing her mother's name is in the history books, and not spending decades fighting to have it acknowledged. And perhaps most significantly, the legal and ethical framework that eventually emerged from the HeLa scandal, the regulations around informed consent that now govern biomedical research, arrives decades earlier. Every patient who came after Henrietta benefits from those protections sooner. The case of Henrietta Lacks became a turning point in the discussion on informed consent. Her story helped shape policies that would later establish the necessity of informed consent. In 1991, the US government introduced the Common Rule, which set ethical guidelines for human research subjects. 1991, 40 years after Henrietta died. 40 years of patients between 1951 and 1991 who had tissue taken, who participated in research, who were subjects rather than partners, because the reckoning that her story demanded took 4 decades to arrive. I want to introduce you to a concept that I think is one of the most useful frameworks for understanding not just what happened to Henrietta Lacks, but what happens to people, to women especially, to people of color especially, to anyone whose knowledge and experience institutions have historically dismissed every single day. It's called epistemic injustice. Philosopher Miranda Fricker developed the concept in her 2007 book of the same name. Epistemic injustice occurs when someone is wronged specifically in their capacity as a knower, as someone whose experience, testimony, and understanding of their own life deserves to be taken seriously. Fricker identifies 2 types. Testimonial injustice, when someone's credibility is dismissed because of their identity, their race, their gender, their class, their age. Their account of their own experience is not believed and not sought because of who they are. Hermeneutical injustice, when society lacks the concepts to understand or articulate someone's experience, when the language to describe what happened to you doesn't yet exist, when you can feel that something is wrong, but the world has no framework to validate what you're feeling. Henrietta Lacks experienced both simultaneously. Testimonial injustice. Her body was taken from because the institution she walked into did not consider her knowledge of her own body, her ownership of her own cells, or her right to be asked to be relevant. She was a Black woman in a segregated ward in 1951 Baltimore. Her testimony about what she wanted did not enter the room. Hermeneutical injustice. In 1951, the conceptual and legal framework for understanding what had been done to her, informed consent as a right, cell line ownership, the ethics of commercializing biological material taken from a patient, barely existed. When the Lacks family eventually learned what had happened, They struggled to find language for their own experience because the language itself was still being invented. I want to be honest with you about why this concept matters beyond Henrietta Lacks' specific story. How many of you have walked into a doctor's office and had your pain minimized, had your symptoms dismissed, been told that what you were experiencing wasn't as serious as you knew it was, and had that feeling confirmed later, perhaps too late, when someone finally listened? How many of you have signed a consent form for a medical procedure without fully understanding what you were consenting to, because the language was technical, the appointment was rushed, and the power differential in that room made asking questions feel difficult? How many of you have had biological material, blood, tissue, a swab taken during a routine appointment and never thought to ask what happened to it after? In the United States, current law generally holds that once tissue leaves your body during a medical procedure, you have no legal rights over it. It can be used for research. It can be sold. You do not have to be told. This is the legal inheritance of what happened to Henrietta Lacks. Improved, but not resolved. In 2023, the Lacks family reached a confidential settlement with one of the corporations that had long profited from HeLa cells. I don't know the terms of the settlement. It is confidential, so nobody does. What I do know is that it took 72 years. It took a best-selling book by Rebecca Skloot in 2010, an HBO film starring Oprah Winfrey in 2017, decades of advocacy led by the Lacks family, and sustained public pressure before a corporation decided that settlement was preferable to continued scrutiny. Justice, when it came quietly, behind a confidentiality agreement, as it so often does. Here's what I want to leave you with. Henrietta Lacks did not know she would change medicine. She did not know her cells would outlive her by 7 decades and counting. She did not know that her name would eventually be on buildings and textbooks in the acknowledgments of research that has saved millions of lives. She walked into a hospital because she was sick and she was frightened, and she wanted to get better so she could go home to her 5 children. She was an ordinary woman living an ordinary life, working, loving, raising children, dancing, painting her toenails red, and she changed the world. Not because she tried to. Not because she was exceptional in the ways the world usually recognizes as exceptional, but because of something inside her, something biological and extraordinary and entirely her own, that the world needed, even if the world was never going to admit that she was the one who gave it. There is something I think about when I think about Henrietta Lacks. We spend so much time worrying about whether we are doing enough, whether our lives are significant enough, whether we will leave anything behind that matters. Henrietta Lacks didn't get to worry about any of that. She was 31 years old, she had 5 children and a husband, and a life that was just beginning to take its full shape when cancer took it from her. And yet, she is in every polio vaccine. She is in the research that mapped the human genome. She is in the laboratory right now in some experiment being conducted by a scientist who has never heard her full name, contributing to something that will save a life somewhere in the world. You do not always know what you're leaving behind. You do not always know who's watching, who's learning from you, who you are changing simply by being fully and completely yourself. There is tragedy in the fact that Henrietta Lacks died so young, but I think the biggest tragedy is that the institution that benefited most from her existence never treated her as though her existence had value beyond what it could extract from her. Don't let anyone do that to you. Know what you're worth, know what you're giving, ask what is being taken, and understand that the legacy you leave may be nothing like what you planned and everything the world needs. Rebecca Skloot's book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, is one of the most important pieces of narrative nonfiction published in the last 20 years. If this episode moved you, read it. The sources for everything covered today are linked in the description below, including the Johns Hopkins acknowledgement of Henrietta's legacy and the peer-reviewed academic literature on epistemic injustice and informed consent in medical research. Subscribe to The Periphery on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, and leave me a comment with this. Has there ever been a moment when you felt like an institution, a hospital, a workplace, a system, treated you as a resource rather than a person? Those experiences are not individual failures, they are systemic patterns, and naming them is the beginning of changing them. And next week on The Periphery, We have spent 2 episodes examining what happens when science takes without asking. Next week, we go somewhere even darker. In 1984, a Japanese guru convinced some of the most highly educated scientists in the country, chemists, physicists, engineers, medical doctors, to build him a fully operational chemical weapons program inside a religious organization. In 1995, his followers released sarin gas on the Tokyo subway. 13 people died and thousands were injured. This is the story of Shinrikyo, of what happens when brilliant people surrender their judgment entirely to a single authority, and of the question that haunts everything we've covered in this 3-part series: how does science lose its soul? Next week on The Periphery.